Welcome to the Sorge podcast, where we explore Sikh and wider South Asian history, art and philosophy with historians, artists and researchers. Would you like to first introduce yourself? Just tell us a little bit about where you're from, your background, your upbringing, where your parents are from, your grandparents. It's always interesting to see how we've all taken these kind of quite incredible journeys to get to wherever we are now.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Shabd Singh, legally last name Khalsa, but that may change in the near future. I grew up in Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. I grew up in the 3HO community, and my parents are both all converts to Sikhi through 3HO. My dad is of Jewish heritage. My great grandparents my great grandparents come from Russia and Poland, and have a very I think classic American story of coming over around the turn of the 20th century. Great grandparents coming here with nothing, and working from being literally, one of them was a lumber worker and ended up owning his own lumber yard. Another one, sold crab cakes on the side of the road to pay his way through university and law school, and ends up becoming a judge and an attorney. And then you have my grandparents, who live very classic 1950s post-war American life, and my dad gets into new age philosophy and experiments with psychedelics and all this kind of stuff, and ends up finding his way towards Kundalini yoga and Yogi Bhajan and Sikhi, and kind of leaves behind his hippie lifestyle and which leads to me. And my mother's side are French. She's from outside of Paris. And my ancestry on both sides there, one are peasant farmers from the southwestern region of France, I also am part Basque, so tiny micro nation, kind of spread across Spain and France, and then the other side of that French family are actually like an old line of Parisian family called the Trousseliers, who end up creating one of the most famous silk flower shops in Paris that's still around to this day. They met after the war and had my mom, and my mom had a sort of a similar journey where she was exploring art and was interested in Eastern philosophy and was searching for something more than what she was raised with, in a kind of typical non-practicing Catholic family, and ends up actually traveling to India by land in the mid-70s. So she goes through Afghanistan before the Soviets invaded it, and ends up in Punjab. And the first place that she finds in India is, of course, Harmandir Sahib, and she falls in love with Sikhi there, but doesn't really know anything about it or what it is. She just feels the vibrations of the kirtan and sitting in Harmandir Sahib, and all she did was spend her time there for the time she was in Punjab, and ends up having a wild journey across India for the next year of her life before finding her way back to France, and by chance meeting a woman who got into Sikhi and Kundalini yoga through Yogi Bhajan as well. And back then that was a real small community. So she ends up in LA where she meets my dad, and then you have me. So I'm born into that community and raised, like I said, in the DC area, and I go to school in Punjab at Miri-Piri Academy in 1999. So when I'm about 11, 12 years old, and spent six years of my education life in Punjab, and after which I studied urban planning and public policy in the States, and then went back to Punjab to teach for 2 years from like 2012 to 2014 at the same school at Miri-Piri. And then in between that period of graduating and now was kind of a tumultuous period of lots of change and travel. I met my now wife, years before. We've known each other for at least 10 years now, and been together for a little over 6. And we had to, for various reasons, we had to travel back and forth or kind of live abroad together in order to be together. And so that kind of took us on a journey where we were living in Mexico at one point, in the UK. I was living in Europe. And then finally she got her green card after we were married and came to the States. And we've been here since. And really for the last, about 3 years now, I have been kind of fully immersed in working in politics, first through volunteering and organizing with the Democratic Socialists of America here in the DC chapter here, and then was very fortunately able to find work in the organizing field. And so my primary work since for the last few years has been political organizing for the the progressive or the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I identify as politically as a socialist. And so I got to work on the second Bernie Sanders campaign, which ended back in about March of this year. And after a period of unemployment, I found work with an organization called Swing Left, which mobilizes Democratic volunteers to defeat Republicans in general elections. So they're not really in the mix of the internecine war of the Democratic Party. They just help Democrats get elected, whoever they are. So I've been organizing for them for about a month and a half leading up to the election, and probably helped organize, I don't know how many, few million phone calls for Democrats across the country, and played whatever very, very small part in the recent defeat of Donald Trump. So yeah, kind of jumped into politics, and it took me further than I could have imagined. And that's basically, in a very, very brief way, where we find me now.
That is an amazing story. Okay, so just continuing on from that, if you do get any spare time, because it sounds like you're incredibly busy, what do you normally spend your time doing, and Sure. What are your hobbies and interests, or is there a particular book you're reading at the moment?
Sure. Well, I'd say the kind of my chief hobby outside of work is my own podcast called The One with Shabd, and it's a podcast that sort of, I guess the best way to describe it is it lives sort of at the intersection of Sikhi, Sikh Affairs, and like left or progressive politics. And a lot of the questions that, or the question that I'm coming with a lot of the time in my interviews is, to what extent is the Sikh project a progressive one that seeks to institute justice, economic, social, and otherwise, and how does that apply in our modern day? And I try to be very careful with that, because there is definitely a tendency of some to, I think, overlay left politics with over Sikhi and kind of try to find these kind of unacademic parallels that are a little bit too simple. And so I'm trying to get at, what is a Sikh project in today's day and age, and what are our politics based on our philosophy, and so that definitely keeps me busy, though it's definitely slowed down to about an episode a month over the last really a couple of years since I've been working pretty steadily in politics. But their most recent book that I read was a great book that we actually just did an episode interviewing the author, Jasdeep Singh Richmond Hill. He's from Canada, and he's a wonderful guy, and he's a great writer, and he wrote a collection of short stories called Sparks from the Same Fire. I genuinely recommend the book. It's just a short book of about 4, I think, short stories that all are asking questions and presenting situations that I think are very relatable to our current moment, that deals with loneliness and sort of finding compassion and finding compassion, feeling compassion for those who may seem to be very different than us. And he does that in a very clever and simple but not simplistic kind of way. And the stories are gripping and the characters are good. Very believable and relatable, even in the short story format. Anyway, I really liked that book, and I thought it was a very intelligent way of communicating Sikh philosophy without using any jargon or lingo or Sikh kind of overt Sikh language or philosophy. It's through the telling of the stories themselves that you kind of understand the philosophy that's underpinning them. And I thought that was brilliant. And I think that that's a lot of what I try to do in my own life when I'm talking to others about Sikhi and when I'm working on the show, is speaking Sikh philosophy in a vernacular that is not, I think, immediately perceived as like a religious ideology, but rather something much deeper, which I think Sikhi is, something more akin to a philosophy that underpins a movement, which is how I like to sort of see Sikhi. Of course, there's a religious component to it, but it's just something that to me is like an approach to reality that informs our choices and our actions and our collective actions. So I really appreciated that book a lot. But, aside from that, I tend to read more nonfiction, and a book that I picked up recently from listening to an interview with the author, but have not cracked into yet, is called The Jakarta Method. And I think if people want to understand our modern history, it's a very important book. What it lays out is the American backing by the CIA of the Indonesian death squads of the 1960s, which some people may have heard of this part of Indonesian history where effectively the reactionary kind of right wing was massively emboldened, funded, and even armed by the CIA to commit genocide against leftists and anybody espousing any kind of justice-oriented or liberatory philosophy in Indonesia, where and it was a part of the CIA's broader project of extinguishing the left wherever it was, especially in the global South. Because what was happening in Indonesia at the time is there had been a democratically elected communist government that they were not revolutionary communists in the sense of overthrowing the government. They'd run in elections and they'd been elected, and they wanted to institute a massive universal set of programs that would redistribute wealth, elevate the working class out of poverty and give workers more power and healthcare and all kinds of things like that. And it was working, and it was popular. And of course, the CIA couldn't have an example of the left succeeding in their goals. So they used those methods that I described to essentially carry out genocide. Over 1 million leftists were killed in this brief period of a few years in the 1960s in Indonesia. And I think it's really important to understand, because a lot of the simplistic responses that we see from folks who don't really understand or who doubt socialism and its potential, a lot of the simplistic responses is, well, where has it ever worked? To look at the USSR, look at China, look at the authoritarianism, etc. But I think if you don't understand that from its inception, socialism has been aggressively attacked by the United States and other Western powers, and specifically undermined and really destroyed, whether from the outside in or the inside out. Similar, example would be Chile under Allende and the military coup by Pinochet and the institution of a far-right authoritarian regime there. Anyway, I think it's super important for understanding our current context, and that the world as we know it is really been shaped by very serious, murderous bloodshed on the part of the United States and other imperial powers in this world. And our whole order essentially operates from that framework and that foundation.
I just wanted to go back to, well, actually, let me rephrase that. Everything you've just said is perfect, and to ask this following question, which is, and it's something that crops up time and time again, and especially within the UK because of the close affinity between Sikhs and the British Army, and historically how they've been kind of one of the key martial races, so to speak.
Sure.
What are your opinions on that? Can you, as a Sikh, be serving in a modern military?
So I think it's important to talk about, to first sort of separate the individual and the collective, because on an individual level, I find it very difficult to tell one Sikh what they can or can't do. I mean, their lives are informed by their conditions and their contexts, and military service may make the most sense for them. But so I in the past, I have been very critical of Sikh individuals who join and are recruited by and join the military. Things like celebrating the allowance of Sikhs to wear their turbans in the military and things like that. I've been very critical of that. But then that's where you start to get into this difference between the individual and the collective, or the structural. So on an individual basis, I feel like it's up to each person to make their path forward, and I can't really judge those people for choosing to serve in the military, because it may be what they and their family need, whether it's an economic situation or also you have instances of people joining the military for immigration purposes and things like that. And so I'm not going to sit here and crap all over people who make those choices. Now, then you get to this idea, the really problematic part is that you're participating in a nationalist project. And then we start thinking about things more structurally collectively. If we look at Sikh history, we see Sikhs who served in imperial armies of non-Sikh rulers, fought as mercenaries in the armies of people who weren't necessarily fighting for Sikh causes.
Historically, Jassa Singh Ramgarhia's father fought in the army of Zakaria Khan, and then Jassa Singh Ramgarhia himself took up employment within the army of Edina Beg Khan. And again, both of those names are normally associated with persecution of Sikhs. Right. And actually, when you read further into it, it's not as black and white as you may at once have thought.
Absolutely. But that's a very different context from the world that we live in now, right? Now we live in a globe of nation states that have national projects and that are functioning in a system of global capitalism. And if we take I think a good sort of way of understanding this is like at the beginning of the 20th century and then, and going into the First World War, the reason the First World War even happens in the first place is to make a very crude explanation of it. It was like a dick measuring contest between the great imperial powers of Europe. It was not really something like World War II, where you have this clear individual state that is seeking to expand and is instituting genocide of the Jews and all of this kind of stuff in World War II, where you have a bit more of a clear sides or kind of vision of what happens if one side loses or the other. In World War I, these were just the biggest imperial powers, and it's really worth, I think, a great if anybody ever has hours of time, there's a podcast called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin that a lot of his political views to me are not very deep, but he does a great job of telling history. And he lays out very well, even if his political understanding of it isn't at where how I would read it. He does lay out very well how World War I comes to be, and it really was like, okay, Germany and France are both getting really powerful, and they are basically afraid that one is going to attack the other. There's all these alliances that are built across Europe and infractions by one or the other side. And then, of course, the assassination of Ferdinand kicks everything off. But the reason that the whole thing was even in the situation that it was, and where you had this powder keg that explodes, is because all of these states are doing colonialism. They're imperial states that are colonizing the rest of the world. They're all jockeying for basically the global south and the opportunity to extract resources. And they all want, a one-up over each other. All of the monarchies that were at the head of these states were literally related to each other. And it was really just about global capital and these nation states trying to secure their position atop the hierarchy.
Sorry, again, just getting your opinion on this. How far would you agree in saying that actually a lot of what Hitler was doing was essentially bringing what you're describing, that colonialist project, into Europe? Because yes, he was developing Lebensraum, or living space, for native Germans, and the British were equally we all know Hitler actually saw the British as equals until they disagreed with his plan, essentially. So
yes.
So yeah, what would
important? That's a very important point. I mean, a great definition of fascism is when the colonial project goes from the perimeter into the metropole. So it's basically internalizing the colonial project and instituting the same kinds of policies that you're talking about, like in the Boer War, in the metropole itself, with undesirable members of society within the imperial core. So you're absolutely right. Hitler is continuing on the ladder that all of these states were climbing. And that's something that's very important, I think, to understand for today as well, that, liberalism, as it's sort of expanded over time, is really only a way station on the way to fascism in the metropole, because at a certain point, foreign wars come home. And so you're creating these conflicts across the globe, these destabilizing conflicts, extraction, domination over certain groups, etc. And that same thinking eventually permeates the thinking of people within the country about how the country itself should be run. And you can absolutely see that. And so that's a really great point. But the reason I'm talking about World War I is because of this. What the Sikhs participated in when they were conscripted through a lot of different means, some by force, some by bribery, some by extortion, and some join the British forces out of this concept of Izzat, this relationship to the brigade and to the corps, and you're serving the Maharaja, King George, and it's a part of your honor and your pride as a Sikh and as a Punjabi and however you identify yourself to take up arms and fight in battle. And so there's a lot of existing sort of cultural concepts that the British, very, I would say, intelligently exploit to conscript and bring people into the military.
There's a really good book on exactly what you're just talking about, and she outlines, you may have come across it, it's by Heather Street, called The Martial Races, and she literally describes and goes through all of the different policies and steps that various people within various places, inevitably within the military or government institutions, pushing for certain changes, primarily in order to do exactly what you're saying. So the colonial project and World War I and World War II aren't unrelated
certainly
topics. So it's interesting that a lot of the policies that were changed, so for argument's sake, you talked about how there are regiments that are based on locality. That was a step enacted by the British in order to boost, or one of the policies enacted by the British to boost numbers, because they were scared, exactly as you were saying, of them having to fight a world war on two fronts. One in order to protect their colonial assets, but equally one to protect their homeland.
Yes, absolutely. When you read that history and you understand that the modern militaries of the West are just a continuation of those same underpinning structures and philosophy, then I think it's important for Sikhs to ask themselves, what role does Sikhi have to play in any of this? Just because we have this rich history and martial tradition among Sikhs, does it mean that soldiery in any context is continuing our heritage? And I would argue that our history, our martial history, is rooted in a justice-oriented movement, which is to throw off the chains of overlords and to liberate people from oppression, be it caste oppression or economic or religious oppression. Somebody once told me, or somebody recently told me, that at the time the Mughal Empire was the largest economic, basically the largest economy in the world, in the time of, when, like, just before its decline in the 1700s. And like, that's an important factor to keep in mind, is like what is oppression? Is it just, I think that sometimes from our religious perspective as Sikhs, we focus so much on these stories of religious oppression and forced conversion that we forget the other kinds of like oppression that were happening. There was the peasantry and low castes, and a lot of the people that end up filling the ranks of the Sikh armies come from these like the lowest groups, and like there was a liberatory element or a liberatory drive in what the Sikhs were doing and why they took up arms, and it has to do with a lot of different things, but I think part of it is domination by the empire, as well as these forced conversions and things like that. And so, like, what are we? You know, what is our philosophy telling us? And my reading is saying we are, you know, all of reality is one and comes from a common source. And the morality that arises from that is to be essentially a warrior on the side of compassion, and that it's just to take up arms when the forces of the opposite of compassion, cruelty, etc., are dominant. Then it's righteous and correct to take up your arms and to fight against that and to institute an order that's based on compassion. So if that is, and so I'm happy to discuss that with people if that's not how they see what Sikh philosophy compels us towards, then I'd like to understand their reading of Bani, and I'd like to understand it, you know, everything better. I think it's easy to sort of nitpick and take out slices of our history and go, well, this was an instance where, you know, Sikhs were acting on behalf of their, you know, there's a clear Sikh side and then the opposing side, and the Sikhs are acting, you know, kind of like a real politique kind of perspective of Sikh action, and that, and that's there. I mean, Sikhs are living in reality, but I think that if you're looking at it from a philosophical perspective, like, what are we fighting for and what are we fighting against? And I don't think that fighting for the imperial order is Sikh. I think that you can be a Sikh who fights in these imperial militaries. I'm not going to deny anybody their Sikhi. I have no authority to do that. But it doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't like pass the smell test of like what we are in reality, like what Sikhs have represented throughout our history. You know, things get complicated in the 18th and 19th century. You know, it's not like Sikhs have been some just pure force of good or righteousness. Certainly not. You know, we have, you know, so anyway, but I would say, what is our philosophy? I believe that our warrior, like our fighting spirit must be rooted in compassion. And I don't think that the imperial orders of today represent compassion whatsoever.
Just a couple of things in relation to what you were saying. So, and again, it's a similar thing that came up yesterday in the last podcast when I was talking to Satnam about the work he's doing with the Sikh Empire, which is, and again, you said pretty much a similar thing, which is it's about engaging with the world around us through a Sikh lens, and packaging and providing a Sikh polity, a Sikh social project, whatever it might be. But it's actually, instead of looking back at a so-called golden age, it's actually studying at that history. It's looking at that, and it's trying to then re-engage with that through a modern lens. And I think the way you've described how the imperial project is very different to the historical times that that we sometimes reference in an analogy in order to compare and kind of prove a point. But no, I just think that it's interesting to engage with that question, because again, it comes up time and time again, and especially because Sikhs are often portrayed within media in one of two ways. Either we're feeding everyone and we're great sevadars and we're kind of providing, or we're fighting. But I also think it's interesting because in both of those situations, we're actually providing where the state is lacking. We are then poster boys because we're filling in for that. We're doing them their service.
Yes. And multiple things there with the sort of tokenization of Sikhs. In the military, one, you have this sense of, look at how diverse we are. Look at how accepting we are, that we have these weirdos with turbans on in our forces. Aren't they nice? You know, isn't that nice of us? And then the other thing is look at them serving food to the homeless when you we're not even stopping to ask why there are homeless people in the first place. And to me, I would never tell Sikhs to stop serving langar to the poor. Absolutely not. I mean, I would love to see us expand our efforts in that case. But what I would like to see is, rather than this sort of charitable model, which is this very sort of Western concept where, you give to the charity and the charity gives to the poor, and, you do your best and, try to help people out, whatever. Sure. That's fine. But the Sikh, in my opinion, langar is a revolutionary concept, not a charitable concept. It's one that says food security is like a human right. It's like, this is a baseline for humanity, and that no one should be hungry, period. And so a Sikh project, to me, says, not only must we serve langar as our duty and our seva, but we must fight the forces that create these conditions in the first place. And so if you have this group of people who, and also, you look at the diaspora, especially the Sikh diaspora that comes to the States and elsewhere, kind of in mid 20th century and beyond. And I separate that a bit from the much more recent immigrants who oftentimes are quite desperate and finding themselves in desperate situations. Those who have been in the West, in the diaspora for a generation or more, have for various reasons found their ways into relative material comfort, and oftentimes buy into this kind of notion of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. See, look, I worked hard for what I have, like you can too. And so we become kind of a model for what it means to be an accepted good American. And we're trying, and you just see it's like trying so hard, it's like see, it's like, accept us with our turbans. See, we're just like you, we work hard and we do charity and we buy into this whole system, unquestioningly. And that's the right way to be. And that's how we become accepted by the broader society. Well, what the broader society is foundationally based on the disenfranchisement of the poor and the working class, and the upward flow of wealth. And it's also fundamentally based on white supremacy that's rooted in colonialism, which had to create colonialism and capitalism, which are inextricable. Colonialism and white supremacy are something that arise in the last few hundred years as a way to create these distinctions between groups in order to segment the working class and to stop any sort of uprising or revolt against the extracting class. So by being a Sikh and kind of proudly supporting the military, proudly joining the military, or I do my langar seva, but I am an executive for Visa and MasterCard or whatever the hell. I'm doing my part, as a part of the American project or whatever project. It's like the Sikh element of it is just a way of instrumentalizing this broader program and project, and sort of at once making it appear more accepting and kind of liberal and open, and also Sikhs trying to sort of justify their very existence along the terms that are set by the dominant society. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you bring up really great points, and that's how I see this question. And I think that, in our modern age, we're not going to carve out empires for ourselves anytime soon, as far as I can see. Even the notion of Khalistan, which I have, I mean, I think that there's a very diverse set of visions and ideologies that that are in that movement, and I agree with some of them, and others I'm resistant to. Okay, so like claiming a land and doing like a Panthic project in a space, or in a certain geography, you're still going to be fighting. You're still going to be functioning within this broader context, structural context of capitalism, global capital, etc., and the nation state.
Yeah, and I think that's the key difference, which is the modern day nation state and how that system works. Even if you were to claim land within that system, you're still running on the same hamster wheel. Exactly.
And so to me, in my armchair general kind of, who am I to kind of say what the Sikh project should be? But just from my thinking and my point of view of the world, I feel like the Sikh project is now, we must sort of take our own beliefs and philosophy at heart. And I think a Sikh project must be universal, and it must be ecumenical. It must be across sections. And sovereignty now, to me, is as Sikhs, we want to be able to be free, to be Sikhs, and live as our philosophy compels us. And so I believe that the only way to do that in this context is to participate in the overthrow of this broader paradigm of capital and the nation state, and a transformation away from it. And we're such a small group that the only way I think that that's really possible is through work across sections and aligning our first building a vision of our project and bringing as many people towards that project as we can, and then finding others whose project or vision is in line with ours, and working together on our own terms to help this broader fight against global injustice, and to create an order that it may not be some sort of a Sikh Raj, but it's a Raj that is Sikh in the sense of how it treats the people within it. And I think that to some that might sound just sort of like a wishy-washy progressivism and an overlay of Sikhi and progressivism, but I think that's our realistic way forward, is to build that. And I think that we have a lot of institutions as Sikhs that we could transform, or not necessarily transform, but realign their purpose and realign their position in this context, and say, Langar is not just something that we do at the Gurdwara for Sikhs, or something that we do under the overpass for homeless people. It's a project of ending hunger. And there's a lot of ways that I think Sikhs could be making the Gurdwara a space where people, no matter who they are or what their religious proclivities are, find solace, find education, find nourishment, find political education. They go to a place to be organized and to be among others who, want to see benefit for all. A Sarbata Pala like philosophy that I think a lot of human beings have. And I think that we just need to become like a beacon of that and say, and to me, the religious aspect of it arises from that. I think that people are attracted by the actions and by the project. and the deeper practice of the religion in terms of meditation on Nam, in terms of contemplating the philosophy, in terms of adopting a certain lifestyle, are things that arise through inspiration from the project of what those people are doing. Whereas I think a lot of the way we're oriented now is sort of like, if we can just get enough Sikhs to take Amrit and be good Sikhs, then we can bring back the golden age. But I think that it's sort of, that's the wrong way around. I think it's like, no, we have to take wherever people are, wherever they stand, and we have to do everything we can to build a golden age right now, where compassion flourishes. And I think that that's how you create the sovereignty, is through a project like that. And I don't really know I don't have marching orders. I don't see myself as some sort of a leader or anything like that. But just in my own sort of ruminating, these are kind of the ideas that I'm grasping at and trying to find like the correct way to express. And I don't feel like I've fully fleshed out these ideas. And these are all just things that through conversation, you asked about like kind of what books I read and stuff like that. I'd say a lot of the learning that I do is through conversation and through learning from other people who are more learned than me. And books are almost secondary. I'm not suggesting that that's the best way to do things. It's just sort of how I learn. So I'm still fleshing things out. I want to deepen my scholarship, and I want to, both in our history and in broader global history and politics, to kind of better express these ideas. But that's sort of how I see a vision of Sikh sovereignty unfolding.
No, I appreciate that. Even just these conversations and the podcast you're doing, the podcast that we're doing, everyone is in their own journey trying to figure things out. And you're right, actually, in engaging with one another and having these type of conversations and learning from others know far more than we do. It's always a good way of developing further. And just continuing on from that then, is there anyone in particular from history you take inspiration from?
Well, the first person that comes to mind when you ask me that question, though if I think about it more, I'll probably think of others, is Malcolm X. I think Malcolm X is a unique figure in modern history. To me, he is like a Janam Shaheed. He is like, he knew he was going to be killed for what he was doing, for inciting, for educating people about their own worth, for compelling people to truly question the system of white supremacy, of capitalism, and who really overcame his own challenges in his life to become something that to me is kind of superhuman, which is, when we talk about our traditions, shaheeds, martyrs, I think that what we focus on and what we admire is that their devotion to Guru was so whole and complete that death was a really kind of it was just like it just didn't bother them. They continued step by step in whether it was protest or war or whatever task they may have been undertaking towards manifesting a vision of, a vision of an order that is seen through the Guru's eyes, one where we treat each other with compassion, where the philosophies that we bow to in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib are made manifest, was so complete that death was not deterrence. And to me, Malcolm X really was walking a very similar path. He obviously finds the Muslim tradition and, initially is in this sort of a cult of the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, where he finds that Elijah Muhammad is, fathering children with 16-year-old members of the mosque and, having extramarital affairs and massively enriching himself and his family. And he goes, this is not Islam. This is not justice. This is nothing what I understand to be my own path. And he parts ways with them. And then all of a sudden he's beset on all sides. He'd already was being monitored by the FBI and the police. And he then makes a ton of enemies within the Nation of Islam. And he knew, there were multiple attempts on his life. He knew that just every step that he took when putting himself out there in public, speaking against, the imperial order of the United States, speaking against the Nation of Islam, etc., he knew he was going to be killed. And he just kept walking. And so I have just tremendous respect for somebody that really lived that, what I feel is a Khalsa mindset in the modern context, where they were fearless. And we have our own tradition. I look at the Sikhs, even if I have my critical analysis of the Sikhs of the period leading up to 84 and the militancy, I have my philosophical differences with, say, like a Sikh nationalism or certain conceptions of Khalistan that people were fighting for, or you can point out, actual sort of like a reverse bigotry that was happening among some Sikhs against Hindus in Punjab, albeit those have been overblown, I think, by propaganda. Even factoring those sort of considerations and criticisms, you look at these people and they were just ready. They were just like, they saw the gross injustice happening before them, and they saw the massive power of the state, and they still picked up whatever weapons they could find and lived like, bandits, hiding and striking Indian forces or police wherever they could. And we can talk about the strategy. We can have all kinds of criticisms, and I don't think any of that is off limits. Same with Malcolm X. Like, you can criticize the project or the way that they went about things and why things may have succeeded or failed. But when we look at them for their commitment and their bravery and their like just staring in the face of death and kind of just going on anyway, to me, those people are really they really give me a lot of like fire and passion, and they make me feel like whatever hardships I'm going through are paltry, and that, if I'm really committed to justice, that, death is like a strong possibility, and that can't be a deterrent. So I really love those characters. I just find them so beautiful and valiant. And
actually, talking about Malcolm X, I can completely see why you would draw those parallels.
Yeah. And I think that I remember once posting pictures of Malcolm X and Jaswant Singh Kalra, and like I was sort of posting back and forth like between Sikhs and then other people who had died, knowing and accepting their fate for justice in their own context. And I was putting the word shaheed underneath each of them. And somebody messaged me and said, well, there's a difference between one and the other. The Sikh, their accepting their death. It's their philosophy is rooted in Gurbani, and we have to hold these people in a different regard or something. Not that we don't respect the others, but like it's a different thing. And I just couldn't get there because like Sikhs we've always drawn inspiration from everywhere. I mean, in our history, we drew inspiration from where it made sense. We drew information and technology from where it made sense, where we could find it and where it could inform our mission and our story. And so
I just think there's a key difference between the Sikh religion, so in terms of practice, kind of how you look, what you do, and then the Sikh philosophy or ideology or ethos, because of course, as we've just discussed, you can completely draw parallels between people like Malcolm X, for argument's sake, and parts of the understanding of Sikhi. However, at the same time, completely, there isn't that Sikh religious identity. So of course, they are. As in, I can understand the other person's issue. Equally, I completely don't necessarily accept it. By default, then we would have to cut out people like, I don't know, Bhagat Kabirji or Bhagat Farid. They don't conform to that Sikh religious identity, so to speak.
I mean, what I've always said is like, if you accept our teachings and we see Guru everywhere, then Guru is everywhere. Guru is everything. And Guru is constantly teaching us. And how Guru manifests is, our separation from it is really a function of ego and an acceptance of Maya rather than constant vigilance for Guru. I mean, if Guru is teaching you somewhere, it's teaching you. And it can manifest and teach in forms that you might not identify materially or whatever as Sikh, but it's still teaching you. And so the outcome to me is like the specific source is less important than like the outcome that it's teaching.
Oh, completely. Just following on from that, I posted the other day a video of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan singing a Gafif that was written by Bulle Shah, and someone had commented below saying, I don't understand why this is on your page, obviously insinuating that because he's Muslim and he's singing something that isn't Gurbani, it shouldn't be on a Sikh page. And I was just taken aback a little bit, like on a number of perspectives. First of all, just historically, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan came from Punjab, Bulle Shah came from Punjab. He's actually singing Punjabi. So in terms of a cultural kind of crossover, it already exists. Right. Secondly, Bulle Shah is contemporary, I believe, to Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And then on top of it, actually the content of what Bulle Shah is talking about is divine love for it or one or whatever you wish to attach a name to. And I'm just like, well, if we're going to get caught up in whether this conforms to our identity politics or our viewpoint or whatever, we're really missing out on the deeper, juicier, meatier understandings. It's not about anything else but that divine union with itness, which is essentially achieved by the eradication of your ego. And I think similarly with what you're saying is that ability to appreciate elements of Sikhi or Sikh ideology from a wider context is hugely beneficial, and we're actually doing ourselves a huge disservice by kind of narrowing our curtains. That's not to say we don't look back at our own history and obviously understand it with great importance, but equally we have to appreciate the wider context. And I think it's brilliant because exactly what we're saying and what you've just been discussing is very similar to what I was talking to Satnam with, which is, again, we need to engage with the wider world. So his research into the Anandpur Darbar shows that it was essentially a powerhouse of learning and understanding. So scholars and researchers from all over India would come there, and they would be paid, in some cases more than the soldiers, by Guru Gobind Singh Ji to either translate certain texts or to copy and write them out. So he was saying that although there's a common number of 52 court poets, there's also a traditional number of 36 calligraphers whose job was just to copy things. And he goes, all they were doing was consuming the culture, the understanding, the philosophy of the time. So things like the Jankiya Rajniti and all sorts of other texts, which on first view, you would perhaps say, oh, they're not Sikh, quote unquote.
Yeah.
I guess in a different way, you're actually living that ideal, which is he's saying we need to be engaging with the wider context and then not necessarily repackaging it, but kind of taking the things that we can work with, adding our Sikhi into that and developing it into a model that works, not just for us, but for everybody.
Absolutely.
So it's great to see those comparisons. And actually, it's great to see someone who is involved in it. So for argument's sake, I just research into history and I like reading and I like kind of diving into certain aspects, but I'm completely devoid of engaging with politics. And actually, after just even the short conversation we've had so far, you have made me rethink a lot of my understandings or perspectives of engaging in politics. And just moving on there, what would you say is most important, or what would you suggest is most key when you're engaging in that field and when you're doing whatever it is you might be doing?
You know, I think that a lot of people feel like they need to have the best analysis, or they need to be the smartest person in the room, or they have to know all the strategy, and they have to, you know, and those things are important. I mean, it's important to be reading in your field. It's important to be, you know, reading, digesting a lot of information. And that's a huge part of what, you know, what helps your political acumen, your ability to strategize. If you're an organizer, it's very important to know the best, you know, the most recent kind of methods and up-to-date organizing strategies and philosophies. I mean, it's so important. But I think even more important than that is something quite simple, which is your philosophical core. Touching back on the Anandpur Sahib Darbar, in a conversation that I had with Louis Fenech, who has done incredible writings about that history, what he described was that at the core of Anandpur Sahib, and what a lot of the calligraphers were doing were copying pothis of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. So there was a mass effort to spread Guru Granth Sahib and to spread the philosophies of the Guru. And then around that was built this whole powerhouse, like you said, of philosophical and intellectual inquiry and development and dissemination. And so I think that as a political operative or whatever work that you're participating in, it's really important to center your own philosophy and ideology, because and because that is where then that's the lens through which you are digesting all of this new information. It's easy to get pulled in a lot of different directions, and to sort of lose your mooring in this world, because then all kinds of other factors come into play. Like if I start out in this work, which I have, with justice as my motivating energy, it's very easy to get pulled away from that, because once you work in this field, you might find yourself biting your tongue so as not to ruffle the feathers of somebody that you might end up trying to work for because you can get a good job with them, right? It's easy to get pulled away, I think, from that core. And I find myself struggling with that all the time. But I end up landing on the side of my core because that's what I'm rooted in, and that starts with Guru Granth Sahib and Sikhi and has evolved to include like a left socialist ideology as a part of my political analysis. And so I think really developing that in yourself and trying to live according to that as best you can, according to your own philosophy, in the terms of how you treat others in your work and how you treat volunteers that you're organizing and how you communicate with them and what your sort of the impetus for what you're doing is like the most important thing. Like I've had, I was on the Bernie campaign and I was a relatively very inexperienced organizer compared to a lot of the people I was on a team with. But my manager said to me at one point, I said to him, I was like having a real kind of crisis of, belonging, because I felt like I was surrounded by all these people who were infinitely more experienced and talented. And he said to me, he's like, Shabd, you're exactly who we want in this movement because you know what you stand for and you are good, basically, in the way that you treat other people. And to me, that's like, and that was really important, because it gave me sort of confidence that, like, practicing and believing in righteousness, and this isn't to big myself up because I make mistakes all the time and I can be an asshole and I can really stray from that core for sure when I'm reacting to something or angry or triggered or whatever. But I mean, I think that's what I always come back to, is trying to find that core philosophy and essence and relating to that and holding on to that as like my anchor, my cornerstone, because that shines above even your intelligence and your analysis. And I think that it leads you to the opportunities and the situations where you're needed and where people want that, because that's in short supply. A lot of people are often very unmoored from a sort of root or anchor, I think are swayed more by these sort of material incentives. And so I think that really it's like if you want to be good in politics, like be a good Sikh, like to the best that you can. And I don't necessarily mean if you drink, you have to stop drinking now or whatever. That's your journey. But look at the core philosophy and really try to like emblazon it into your heart, because I think that is more powerful and lasting than anything, and it ends up shining above even flashy analysis or intelligence, which isn't to say don't keep reading and expanding your knowledge, but I just think that that's the most important thing. If your goal is justice, if your goal is succeeding in a career in politics, then actually you should do the opposite of what I'm saying, and you should be completely unmoored and be just like a total sycophant, because then you will find great high-paying jobs for, just absolute demons. But that's just not what I'm going for. So it depends on what kind of political career you want to lead.
I appreciate that. I completely understand where you're coming from. So just continuing on then, you spoke about how your parents first got into Sikhi via 3HO and how your, I guess, initial exposure to Sikhi and understanding of Sikhi came through, again, a 3HO understanding and a lens. So just tell me a little bit more about how that was in terms of kind of engaging with that entire setup and where has it left you today?
Well, I think that, for all of its faults and for all of Yogi Bhajan's perversions of Sikh teachings that I think were done to support his own individual ends, I think that there was a core of Sikhi that we were exposed to, that I was exposed to from a very young age. And my parents, were very devout to their Sikhi, and I was raised with a real sense that this tradition that I belonged to was profound and liberatory, and from a very early age, was I think the message was that, the material world that we live in is impermanent, and attachment to it and to material is folly. I think that was a really early lesson that I got. And I also was taught, meditation and breath control and yoga, which, yoga is not some core part of Sikhi, but I do believe that, well, actually, it depends on your definition of yoga. But when I'm talking about asanas and stuff like that.
Well, I was just going to add that there is some historical research to show, I think one of the gurus set up yoga akhadas, or akhadas that taught yoga amongst other disciplines. So,
okay, well, we need to get that out there, because this is a very interesting hotbed discussion these days. I really want to learn more about that.
I don't know enough about it to say definitively categorize like, this is X, Y, and Z. Again, just trying to add a little bit of context just to help.
Yeah. And I think that the point that I've come to about that question is that it's a very gray area that needs a lot more discussion and research. And, Nam Simran is yogic in the sense that you are meditating and focusing and repeating a word or a concept. I mean, that is yogic in terms of a practice. And there are yogic elements of our practice, although you wouldn't describe, like, it's not necessarily described as yoga in the sense of how we understand it in our modern context. So
just on that one, just quickly, just to ask, would you say that modern day yoga has been bastardized?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty clear. I think, especially if you look at the modern, like where modern yoga comes from, that's a whole other long discussion. But it's really a result of a lot of people in the West, specifically in America, who were of Indian origin, that were taking concepts or practices that they were maybe somewhat familiar with from home, and then melding them with like a sort of Western spiritualism in order to create a product that they could travel around and sell. So modern yoga to me is it's a product that's been developed over, the last century and a half in America, and has kind of become the modern understanding of what yoga is. I'm not against, like, I'm not going to then say people shouldn't go do their vinyasa class because it makes them feel great and it stretches their body and they get benefit out of the breath control. And so I'm not so interested in like the black and white sort of conclusions about it, but I definitely think that it's important to understand, like, historically what modern yoga is, and I think that it's pretty detached from its origins, which are ultimately about the overcoming of the ego and the goal of kind of true perception of reality, and kind of dispelling delusion or illusion from the mind, and recognizing our oneness with it, like you've been saying, which I really like, with itness. And so yes, I think that there's a big divergence there. It's been commodified, and it's been made into sort of a self-help product that in many ways reinforces the ego, by saying, you can kind of develop these wonderful attributes by practicing these things. And, to me, that's sort of antithetical to, that's what Guru Nanak is like, criticizing the Siddhs of kind of like, yeah, like you can develop all these like powers, or you can do all these great feats of asceticism and stuff like that, but you're kind of forgetting the like core point of all of this, and you're detached from the world, and you're not taking this philosophy and trying to inject it into the reality around you. You're just sort of cloistering yourself. And in our modern context, you could say that, you know, instead of asceticism, it's like a hyper materialism of like, selling self-help products and kind of becoming a perfect island unto yourself. So in either direction, the criticism still stands, and, you know, leave it to Guru Nanak Dev Ji to make a criticism that lasts, you know, that's a solid one for 500 plus years. So, yes, but in my upbringing, I was raised with yoga, and at the heart of our yoga, I would say, was pointing back to Sikhi as like the ultimate sort of source and authority. Now, that was true of my upbringing and my specific context. We can look at Yogi Bhajan and everything that he's done, or that he did, and we can see how it was very self-serving, and he was enriching himself, and he ends up abusing women, and it's just this horrible thing. But I would say that in my upbringing, in my community, we were across the country from him and didn't really see him all that much, that there was really something there in terms of building community, meditating together, learning about Sikhi. You know, my dad, we would be sitting in Divan on Sunday, and my dad would, a little kind of game we would play, or a little thing he would do is he'd say, you know, we'll get ice cream after Gurdwara when you listen to the Hukamnama translation, if you tell me what it means in your own words.
That's incredibly beautiful. I think it's such a nice way of getting you as a child, or any child, if you were to use it, to actually thoughtfully engage. Yeah, sorry, please continue.
No, it was very alive. You know, I mean, Sikhi was very alive in my upbringing. It was a part of our fabric of our life, and kind of learning about the world. And you know, that was one little example of it. You know, I think that it was just fun. You know, he made it kind of a fun thing and an interesting thing, and then he would ask me questions, you know, based on my surmising summarizing of the Hukamnama. He would then ask me questions about, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? And, you know, I don't ever remember him. You know, sometimes he would say, okay, you know, well, this is like, you know, you're saying this, but I would say, you know, this, and he would kind of try and teach me in one way or the other. But a lot of the time it wasn't really like he was coming back with like a definitive answer. It was more like getting me to think about it and talk about it. And that was really great, because from a young age, I felt like I had a lot of agency in my Sikhi, because the relationship with the Guru was very direct, instead of diffused between sort of me and then like the Granthi, kind of who knows everything. And then I'm this like, who am I? You know, I can't, like, I was really shocked when I went to the UK, or when I went to, or I meet Sikhs who, you know, have grown up in Sikhi their whole life, and they didn't really ever like sit down and read from the Guru, or until like much later in life. And from a very young age, I was like encouraged to first, in that kind of instance, like try to make an understanding of what was being said. And then a little bit later, you know, when I was a better reader and a better, and just kind of old enough to kind of understand our customs and traditions around, you know, reading and interacting with the Guru, I was, you know, reading, and I was participating in Akhand Paths and stuff like that. So it was like, I felt really lucky that I had this real agency and this like kind of individual one-to-one connection with Guru Granth Sahib Ji, where I felt like it was like my Sikhi was really like in my hands, and it wasn't for somebody else. So it was really important. And so being raised in that was I think fantastic in many ways. And it gave me a real strong sense of my own identity as a Sikh. That's how I identified myself before any other kind of identity, was as Sikh from birth. And, you know, the difference between me and Sikhs of Punjabi origin that we went to Gurdwara with and that we saw in our lives was, I understood that we came from different cultures or from different backgrounds and stuff, but you know, I just saw myself as part of the same community from the beginning. And it really gave me a sense of sort of resistance to outside like criticism or outside name calling, things like that. You know, when I was going to public school, I felt very defiant. And I know that a lot of kids struggle with bullying and stuff like that. And I have nothing but, you know, compassion, you know, with them. And I experienced it, but for whatever reason, my response to it was not like depression or self-doubt. It was almost like a reaffirmation of like, you know, because I was listening to these stories of, you know, the Guru's army fighting, you know, a force that's 10 times bigger and standing to the last man. And, you know, I felt like I was like, you know, taking people's bullying or whatever and fighting back or pushing back against it or whatever, and standing up to them was like, you know, part of that same tradition or whatever. And so, you know, but that's just me in that moment, how I kind of understood things. And I feel lucky for that. And I became very solidified in that. And it was like, you know, then I started going to school in India when I was about 11 or 12. And even before that, I experienced a really intense kind of pecking order and bullying within my own community. And that was coming from the kids that were going to the school in India. And when I went to the school in India, you know, it was a very sort of Lord of the Flies kind of situation where there was very limited oversight, not really any kind of like parenting or counseling happening. It was just like a bunch of kids that sort of had this routine and this schedule, and you know, were contained in a campus, but without very much supervision. And then even when there was more supervision and more structure implemented into the system, you know, we were still just sort of amongst each other, raising ourselves and raising each other. There wasn't like parenting happening. There wasn't like adult care happening. It was more like the adults in our lives were more like wardens, you know, and we were prisoners, or, you know, whatever, however you want to think about it. It's like, that was more, I think, of what the relationship felt like. And that really, you know, there was this long history in that school of like really serious bullying and pecking order. And, you know, as I've grown up and talked to people who are kind of involved in the community, who are older than me, who went to the schools before me, what you learn is that, you know, Yogi Bhajan, this is a very common practice in cults, is to separate children from their parents in order for the parents to be able to focus more wholly on the cult and on the master and on the goings on of the cult. And what we know now too, and what I know now, and what many people knew long before me, was that Yogi Bhajan was, whether he was sleeping with his students, or he was raping them, or doing all different sorts of coercion and domination, that the end result was a consolidation of his power and a collection of wealth. So I think Yogi Bhajan was a really devious character because he did give something to people in the form of yoga and Sikhi that served their lives in many ways and enriched their lives in many ways, and genuinely helped them. If you talk to many of the people that joined in the early days or have still continued to get involved with Kundalini yoga and stuff today, but it was all structured within an authoritarian system at which, where he sat at the top. And that bled into every institution that he created, including the school. And he sent somebody to the school in India back in the early days who's now deceased. His name was Nanak Dev Singh. And he was, by all accounts, a total masochist. He was a real masochist and a real authoritarian bully who actually instituted pecking orders among the kids, where he would get older boys to beat up on younger boys who were out of line and things like that. And himself, was beating up and humiliating kids if they were breaking rules, or if they were late to something, or if they were out of uniform, or whatever the case might be. So it was a really dark place for people back then. Some people had good experiences. Some had very, very bad experiences. But that pecking order really continued on. And the school was built in a vision of the people who built its understanding of Yogi Bhajan's teachings as the end kind of goal of what the school was about. So it was like, his authoritarianism and his teachings were the underpinning of that whole institution. And I'd argue that they still are to this day, although the organization and the school have improved in many ways, that those things are still very much there. And that was what I was immersed in for years. And I got good experiences out of that. And I also got a lot of pain and trauma from that experience. And, the good parts were being in Punjab, being in a world different than the one I was raised in, having my conception of reality kind of broken by living in a very different one, being able to understand seemingly different peoples and cultures and stuff in a way that I would have never been able to if I'd stayed in suburban Northern Virginia. An appreciation of our history, culture, philosophy, our customs, our food, our, everything. Like I'm so, Punjab is like really like a second home and like has a deep place in my heart thanks to my time there. And then at the same time, I was being bullied. I was in a restrictive kind of authoritarian school system where I felt very angry a lot of the time, very repressed a lot of the time. A lot of Yogi Bhajan's teachings also dealt with sort of sexual repression and kind of making us feel like even if it wasn't explicitly said, because it was kind of given lip service to the idea that, sex, for example, is a natural thing and it's not something that you should feel ashamed of or blah, blah, blah. And yet at the same time, we were told that, his teaching said if you have sex with somebody, a man imprints his psyche onto a woman's arc line, which is this sort of aura kind of concept that he had that would imprint on a woman's psyche for years at a time. And so you had this sense that if you were intimate with a woman outside of marriage and outside of like a pure, perfect, divine love, that you were harming her in some way, which created all kinds of problems for both the men and the women, boys and girls in the school, and created a lot of bizarre pathologies in our sort of sexual understanding of ourselves. And and just our basic understanding of ourselves. And so there's a lot going on there, that was very twisted, I would say. And it arises from the core of Yogi Bhajan and who he was. And, when I kind of look back at my upbringing and then look at what I've learned about Yogi Bhajan more now, it makes a lot of sense, because what I see is an authoritarian who's disseminating his ideology in order to make a system that continues to reify him and his power. And so making people doubt themselves and hate themselves and think that they need this practice or this philosophy or him to be good people is a great way to maintain your power. And especially when I started studying like socialism and how capitalism and authoritarianism function, I saw a very similar. I saw an analogous kind of thing going on between of what like Yogi Bhajan was doing at like a micro level within our community. And there's so many ways that manifests, including white supremacy, like within 3HO. Yogi Bhajan, for example, in the early days, there's this story where he has one of his secretaries write these letters that he has translated into Punjabi and submitted into kind of all of the diaspora newspapers that are basically lambasting Punjabi diaspora Sikhs, saying, "Oh, you guys have failed. You're cutting your hair, you're drinking, your children aren't keeping Sikhi, and look at us. We've converted, and our children are being raised as Khalsa, and all this kind of stuff." And you go, why would he do that? But to engender a sense of, I think, mistrust and dislike between the communities, and I think that he was playing on the existing white supremacy that you would have found in any American of that day, and creating a kind of a division between white and brown Sikhs. And, that same kind of mentality existed within the community. If you had brown Sikhs that kind of got involved in 3HO, or if you had Sikhs who were black or people who were black or of other races involved in sort of the 3HO community, there was absolutely a sense of racial hierarchy and things like that. And it served him because it kept people divided. It kept him as the authority. It kept, you didn't have white Sikhs intermixing too much with brown Sikhs who might have different views than Yogi Bhajan, or might have knowledge of Yogi Bhajan's misdeeds that they've heard through the kind of pipeline of the diaspora's communication and stuff like that. So, it's like everything that he was doing, he was running these big businesses where they, in some cases, they were straight up illegal and fraudulent, and they were getting money out of getting money through fraudulent means, like doing sales calls where they would sell, printer ink to small businesses, and, for huge margins, way overpriced, and never actually filling the invoice and sending the toner, and, making a bunch of money off of that. And a bunch of that was being kicked up to him. There was no, and because there was just this sort of upward looking devotion to his authority, you would never have workers in those situations thinking about their own means or, worker power or their wages or anything like that, because everything that they're participating in is according to the great, master, and everything is as it should be. And so we abandon any kind of like self-respect or sense of self-determination and kind of surrender it all to him. And that, again, is like very similar to how capitalism works and how power is maintained in our current society. So I grew up in that, and I really believed in him for many, many years. And I would say that it was in my early 20s that when I started reading some great Sikh history books, particularly by the guys from Kashi House, In the Master's Presence, and these other works that they've done that really sort of lay out the pre-colonial history in a way that hadn't quite been laid out in as accessible of a form before that, at least that I'd come across. It definitely started to show me a very different understanding of Sikhi, and started to break a bit of my devotion or trust in Yogi Bhajan and his Sikhi, because I started to see glaring kind of problems. And so that started to give me just a much more, critical and skeptical mindset that made me like less willing to just believe in everything I was being told from my community. And I would say that, the final break was in the last couple of years. I for many years, I still associate with 3HO community members. It's like a family to me. I love many of my aunties and uncles that I was raised, by, and but especially in the last couple of years, when all of these allegations really saw the full light of day, even though they'd been around for many, many years, and I was able to read accounts and talk to friends who'd had personal experiences with him, it became really clear to me what he was. And even before all of that, when I started getting into socialism, and before all of these accusations really, really saw the light of day, I was already seeing a lot of the same patterns in him and in my own community that you see in the broader world. In terms of, economic hierarchies and other forms of hierarchies and domination and control that I saw within my own community. I was like, oh, well, back then I thought, it's like he tried to do something good, but you can't escape the broader context that you're living in. And so 3HO just becomes basically another white liberal bastion that just happens to be wearing turbans, but effectively buys into the status quo of the world as we see it and has benefited from it. So they buy into it, and they have no sort of revolutionary or contradictory point of view to the way things are. And that was kind of my analysis. But then when I started to learn more about his specific actions, it became really clear to me that not only were we just like, the broader world, but, he was just like the broader world. He was creating something in the image of existing authoritarian systems. And, so that was kind of that's like my short analysis of like Yogi Bhajan and the community I was raised in, and so it's left me, I'm in therapy, I'm dealing with that kind of stuff. I'm digging into my own past and, wondering why it's so hard for me, for example, to do, I have a really hard time with like self-discipline and, developing like a daily spiritual practice, in part because it was really heavily like kind of forced down my throat from a young age. And I have this kind of deep, like psychosomatic aversion to like sitting down and reading thought or like meditating or doing yoga or anything. really anything that's like good for you, like exercising and stuff like that. I have this deep psychological battle that I deal with all the time because of it. I have a lot of reactionary masculine tendencies that crop up in my relationship with my wife, where I react very poorly to certain situations, and I look back to the culture that I was raised in and how there was a deeply toxic masculinity, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but really it was, and it really kind of comes from the top in the culture that he created and the relationships between men and women. So I'm digging through all of that kind of stuff and just trying to sort through it and heal and find a way forward, and hopefully helping in some small way organize members of like my generation that come from the community to political action within the community to try to rectify the wrongs of the past. And, you know, that doesn't even touch the surface of another huge problem with 3HO in the community, which was its relationship to Sikhi, to Punjabi Sikhs, and some of the harm I think that we've done to Sikhi in terms of the pedagogy of Sikhi that comes from 3HO, you know.
Just before we dive further into that, just a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you in reference to what we were just discussing. So obviously when we're talking about Yogi Bhajan and the 3HO and we refer to it as a cult, but just to provide a bit of context around that, I'm sure you're aware of the Jim Jones cult. So just to try and draw some analogies, would you say that that's kind of a similar setup?
I mean, certainly in some ways, yes, except Yogi Bhajan's end was not... It was to create kind of this sort of capitalist empire that would serve him, and like an endless flow of women, again, to serve him.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Akal Security is one of the businesses, that he helped set up, right?
Yeah, and that gets us back into this whole question of imperialism and the nation state and how we cooperate with or interact with the military, because a lot of its contracts came from the military and the U.S. government.
Interesting. So just continuing on from that then, I just wanted to ask then, why do you think a lot of the truth has only come out in the last few years, so to speak? Like I'm sure a lot of people listening are more than aware that these type of accusations have been circulating for quite a while. But in terms of actually it being kind of validated or shown to be true, it's taken quite a long time for that to happen. So why do you think that's only occurred recently?
Well, it was triggered by the release of a memoir by a woman previously known as Premka. Her name is Pamela Dyson, and she was kind of his main assistant in many of the early years. She left the community, I believe, in like the 80s or 90s after coming forth basically saying these things about Yogi Bhajan, that he was having sex with his students. And at the same time that she had a lawsuit, a woman called Kate Felt brought a lawsuit against Yogi Bhajan accusing him of raping her. And Pamela left the community and in the last couple of years, she wrote this memoir, and it was released in I want to say like February of 2019, I think, but I'm not 100% sure. It might have been February of this year. Time is just escaping me and all smashed together at this point. So that was a really big thing because it was circulated widely, and a lot of people in the community read it, and a lot of people that were previously involved in the community read it, and it created, like in the online space, it created a lot of opportunities for people to basically compare their stories and to be like, oh, I wasn't alone. So before that, what it was like a lot of accusations from former members, and of course in the Punjabi community. And I think because you didn't have this case where it was like all at once, a lot of women coming forward kind of at the same time and going like, oh, there's a sort of critical mass that of other people that are telling their stories, I'm going to tell mine. So it was similar to like the Me Too movement, where, you know, we've all known, you know, or many of us knew about the gross, you know, misogyny in industry and in entertainment, blah, blah, blah. But the Me Too movement comes about when a lot of people start like telling their stories all at once, and it just sort of becomes like too loud to be drowned out. And I think that that's what happened in this case as well. Even though these stories had been out there in many places for a long time, it was just sort of a critical mass of things coming together, the technology and the ability to communicate, that I think pushed it over the edge and made it much more widely known. And you had a lot of people coming forward who had never told their stories before, and who in instances were still sort of prominent members of the community who like kind of still loved the community and didn't want to see it damaged, but they felt like they couldn't keep their story in any longer. And that added a sense of credibility. Whereas, like, you know, in the mind of somebody in the community, or who has a doubt in their mind about him having ever done those things, if the messenger is a former community member who left, then you can tell yourself, oh, they were rubbed the wrong way and they made up these stories and they just hate the guy and they hate our community, or whatever the case might be, the story that you tell yourself. And then all of a sudden it was just like so many people from so many different kind of spectrums of the community coming together and saying this happened, that I think is what allowed it to kind of go over the edge and really become clear to be, you know, that what happened did in fact happen. So then it created this sort of reckoning within the community, where there was like an internal inquiry where a third-party organization interviewed tons of community members, current and past, and from throughout the history of the community. And it found, you know, it's not a legal investigation, so it can't determine guilt or innocence, but the language that they used was more likely than not that all of these things happened and that it was systemic. And they also did a great job of interviewing supporters of Yogi Bhajan who were defending his memory and making very clear that they had no specific refutations of the allegations. All they had were their sort of built-in cult responses, which were to talk about how he could read auras and he was this magical, wonderful, you know, being. And it really sort of lays out the cult mentality that allowed this to happen in the first place, where anybody who raised their voice in criticism was immediately shut down and ostracized from the community. Not necessarily because everybody in the community is supportive of like sexual abuse, but because they had been so effectively programmed to take any kind of criticism as just like an attack, and that it needed to be routed out and pushed away. So it you know, I think it's important to say too, it's like, you know, there's a large percentage, probably a majority of the community that really had no idea about these sexual misdeeds, for example. And then the other misdeeds, the sort of the authoritarianism and the businesses and all this kind of stuff was sort of like built into the ideology to the point where they were just like, oh, this is just the way things are and this is the right way to do things. And, you know, so they didn't have the sort of outside perspective or the ability to look at themselves or look at things from a different perspective to criticize these things or to see the problems or the contradictions that were inherent in them. So it's kind of a classic story of like, you know, even people who were being harmed by the system were supporting the system because they were so deeply convinced that it was right and true and good. And I think it's important to say that because there's that like it shouldn't be like a black and white thing in terms of like, it shouldn't be viewed in black and white terms what this community is, because it is a community of people, and there's definitely a lot of differing points of view among the people of the community. And you have that happening now, where there's this sort of battle for the political leadership of the community between people who believe the allegations and people who don't believe, or who refuse to believe and are actively suppressing the allegations. And that's a very interesting story that's really currently playing out, like, as we speak.
Well, that nicely leads us on actually to the next question, which I was going to ask you, which is, do you think that 3HO have managed to part from the legacy of Yogi Bhajan, and would you distinguish between the community of 3HO and 3HO as an entity?
Yes, the community is pretty big and pretty disparate. You have a lot of people who, they do Kundalini yoga. Maybe they got their certification, and they don't identify with Sikhi. They're not like deeply immersed in some ashram or the community itself or the institutions. They, just like any other yoga practice, they relate to it kind of as, it's something that they do and that they like, and they teach it, and they might have community around that, but it's not like, the olden days of 3HO where people like lived in ashrams and it was this pretty highly organized thing where, most of the adherents were converting to Sikhi, and, so it's different now in that sense. And then even people who have been around in the community for a long time, or who are from, the second or third generation of the community, all have very different points of view about a lot of what's going on. And the entities themselves, I would say there has been movement in the right direction, where some younger members of the community have, and I say younger, people in their 40s and stuff, because until recently it was literally just all first generation people that were in the kind of administrative positions. But in the last several years, there's been younger folks who have ended up on these boards and in these positions of power in the institutions that do bring a more critical lens and are asking these kinds of questions about, the history of the community and Yogi Bhajan and stuff like that. And there's a battle kind of going on right now for control of the institutions in the future. As it exists right now, some of the institutions such as KRI, Kundalini Research Institute, which is the one that administers all of the certification of like yoga teacher certifications and runs these courses. They've done things like trying to institute like a more hefty and kind of better like ethics system, and they've tried to inject kind of social justice language into some of the like pedagogy and reinforce kind of already existing things that just like weren't failed basically. And so to me, it's like what that is more of like an incrementalist kind of approach to the problem. It's not looking at things from a root level. It's not asking what is fundamentally wrong with the institutions, what could be changed fundamentally with the institutions in terms of the governance structure or in terms of, its stated purposes and goals and how it actually measures its own success, being instituted. It's more of like adding flowery language to kind of paper over some of these problems and to appear to be dealing with this problematic history. And I don't think that it's necessarily like I think a lot of the people that are in those roles that are making these decisions are people that actually do believe that Yogi Bhajan was, did these wrong things. But they are so unable to analyze things from like a more radical root level perspective because they're products of the system so much that they just can't really conceive of what like a real radical shift would look like. So there's some work being done there, and there's some efforts being done there to change things, but it's not going deep enough. And that's where this political question comes into play.
I like the fact that everything that we've spoken about, you're always looking at the bigger picture and about the systems and the structures that are in place, rather than perhaps looking at the individual obviously plays a role, but the structures and the systems also enabled individuals to be able to do certain things. It's quite helpful because even in a field of perhaps just research and stuff, it helps to ensure you're looking you're not kind of blinkered just perhaps in what you're reading or what you're researching or what you're looking at. You're actually looking at the far wider context behind all of that.
I mean, this is the difference. This is, there's a criticism that you'll see that the left, like socialist left, will make of liberals is, that socialists have a materialist analysis and a materialist political project as compared to liberal idealism. Idealism is not bad in and of itself in terms of thinking about what the ideal would or could be. But idealism in the sense of like, it's all about having the right people with the right ideas in the system to make it work correctly. Like if you just get that, then you've solved the problem. When the materialist analysis says, no, we have to examine the system in and of itself and how material forces shape the people and the world, because the system is a lot more powerful than any individual. So I think that correctly identifying and analyzing systems is so important to then determine our individual actions and our position and where we fit and what our mission is. And it's good too, because like you said, it's not like you don't just let people off the hook who've done something wrong, but by understanding how a system compelled them to do something wrong is so important, because if you just look at the individual and you stop the individual from doing harm, the system will recreate those conditions to then cause another individual to do harm. So we have to be looking at things systemically, structurally, both within our own community, within our own institutions, and how we interface with the broader structures of the world to, I think, really understand a path forward. Because then otherwise you're just projecting your ideals out into the world without any real analysis or path forward of how to manifest those ideals into reality. Like truth is high, but higher still is truthful living, right? Like that, right? It's like, I forget the exact line. I think it's from Jop Sahib where Guru Gobind Singh is listing all of the different texts of different faiths and saying, ultimately my head lies at the foot of the one. All of these philosophies, all of the texts that you can read, all of these ideals and ideas. I am an intellectual. I want people to be exploring everything. I don't want people to be shutting themselves off to these things. But we have to remember, like, our head lies at this very elemental oneness, and we have to. The lens that we have to be analyzing all of these different ideas through has to be rooted in your head being at the foot of the one, and recognizing compassion and oneness as kind of the real truth of life, of what life is about, is manifesting that into reality. And if your textual and idealistic and philosophical understanding is disconnecting you from that elemental truth of compassion, then you're in that situation where, that the gurus are constantly criticizing, and in every page of Gurbani, that's, I think, what the guru is trying to remind us of, is like, you can have all the highest ideas, you can have all the best intentions, but if you're not really like dealing with where the rubber meets the road, if you're not really manifesting a compassionate order around you, in the world around you, then it's just ephemera. It's just another aspect of Maya and illusion pulling you in some direction. So Sikhi can be that too for people, unfortunately. Even though I think it's pointing us in a different direction, Sikhi itself can become another ephemeral thing, the way that every other religion or every other ideology can itself be, if you're not rooting it in something.